I was just trying to enjoy a quiet morning at my lake cabin, coffee in hand, breeze off the water, when I got blindsided by an HOA president who thought running a neighborhood meant running people over, literally, with bulldozers. I didn't move out here to start a war, but when they fenced off my path and started messing with things my dad and I built together, yeah, something in me snapped. Turns out I own the only dock for miles, and that changed everything. Ever had to fight for something that should have just been yours? Drop a comment below. You're watching HOA Stories, and if you want to help keep these stories coming, that thanks button down there makes a real difference. I stared at the paper in my hands, thinking someone must be filming a prank show somewhere nearby. No way anyone could be serious writing this kind of stuff. The letter was printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with some fancy logo that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Dear Mr. Sterling," it began. And I already knew this wasn't going to be good news. "The Homeowners Association Board has determined that your continued use of the informal walking path to the lake area damages community aesthetics and doesn't align with our new development standards." I actually had to read that sentence 3 times before my brain could process what they were trying to tell me. My walking path damages community aesthetics? I bought peace, not permission slips. The letter went on to explain that I needed to cease and desist using the path that I'd been walking for the past 2 years since buying my cabin. 2 years, not 2 weeks or 2 months, but 2 entire years of walking the same route to the lake every morning with my coffee, every evening to watch the sunset, and every weekend when friends came to visit. The path wasn't even that fancy. Just a worn dirt trail through some trees that connected my backyard to the shore. It wasn't hurting anyone, wasn't blocking anything important, and honestly wasn't even visible from most of the other houses. But apparently, Lorraine Beaumont, the newly elected HOA president, had decided it was an eyesore that needed to disappear. I decided to handle this like a reasonable adult and give them a call. Big mistake. The HOA office secretary, who sounded like she was maybe 19 years old and definitely not getting paid enough to deal with angry homeowners, basically told me that board decisions are final and Mr. Sterling should have attended the community meeting if he wanted input. Community meeting? I never got any notice about a meeting, and trust me, I check my mail religiously because I'm paranoid about missing important stuff. When I explained this to the secretary, she just said, "Well, the notice was posted on the community bulletin board for the required 14 days. The community bulletin board that's located next to the clubhouse, which is about 3 miles from my cabin and not exactly on my daily route." 3 days after that phone call, I woke up to the sound of construction vehicles in my backyard. Not near my backyard, not in the general neighborhood, literally in my backyard, right where my walking path started. Orange mesh fencing was going up everywhere, along with official-looking signs that said, "Construction Zone, no entry," in bold red letters. The workers installing it looked just as confused as I felt when I walked outside in my pajamas and asked what was happening. "Lady told us to fence off this area," one of them said, pointing toward a woman in a crisp white blazer who was standing about 50 feet away, supervising the whole operation. That was my first real look at Lorraine Beaumont, and I have to say, she looked exactly like someone who would shut down a walking path for aesthetic reasons. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect posture, and absolutely no expression on her face when she noticed me watching her. Her white blazer looked ridiculous in the muddy construction zone, like she was attending a board meeting in a swamp. When I walked over to ask what was going on, she didn't even introduce herself, just launched into this speech about community standards and property value protection like she was reading from a script. "This area is being prepared for landscaping improvements that will benefit the entire neighborhood," she told me, not making eye contact. "Residents will need to use alternative routes to access lake facilities." Alternative routes? The nearest public lake access was almost a quarter mile away, down a steep hill that turned into a muddy mess every time it rained. I tried to explain that I'd been using this path for 2 years without any problems. And that's when she finally looked directly at me. "Previous usage doesn't establish legal rights, Mr. Sterling. I'm sure you understand." The way she said it, like she was talking to a child who'd gotten caught stealing cookies. Something in her tone suggested this wasn't just about my walking path. The way she kept glancing toward the lake, measuring distances with her eyes, talking about future community enhancement projects. It felt like she had bigger plans that required my little trail to disappear permanently. "We're exploring several lakefront beautification initiatives that will transform this entire area," she said, with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course, we need proper clearance and control over all access points to ensure the project's success." I actually had to stop and stare at her after that statement. This wasn't about community standards at all. This was about clearing the way for whatever vanity project she had in mind. So there I was, standing in my own backyard looking at orange fencing that blocked my access to the lake I'd bought this property specifically to enjoy. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd left city life because I was tired of feeling trapped and controlled, and now I was trapped and controlled in what was supposed to be my peaceful retreat. That first evening, when I had to walk the long way around to reach the lake, my boots sinking into mud with every step, I kept thinking about how this was exactly what I'd tried to escape. Every step I took sank me deeper into exactly what I was trying to get away from. The whole situation felt surreal, like someone had moved my cabin into the middle of a corporate office building while I was sleeping. That night, I called Harold Finch, a retired law professor who lived about a mile down the road and had helped me with some property questions when I first moved here. Harold was one of those guys who knew everything about local history and had opinions about everything else. "Right-of-ways disputes," he said when I explained the situation. "Happens more often than you'd think around here. HOAs get a little power and suddenly think they own every blade of grass in the neighborhood." He promised to do some research and get back to me, but I could tell from his tone that he was taking this seriously. Part of me wondered if this was just me being stubborn, but the other part, the part soaked in mud, couldn't let go. Standing there knee-deep in mud that evening, staring at that orange fence one more time, I realized I had two choices: accept defeat and let them win, or find out just how far these people were willing to push an ordinary guy who just wanted to be left alone. I wasn't sure which choice I was going to make, but I knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a simple property dispute. This wasn't about a fence, it was about power, and she thought I had none. Harold called me 3 days later, with news that made my morning coffee taste a lot better. "You need to get down to the county records office," he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "Bring a camera, and maybe buy your friend Harold lunch afterward, 'cause I think we just found your smoking gun." I'm not even sure why I felt so nervous driving to the courthouse that morning. Maybe because I'd never been in a real property dispute before, or maybe because I was starting to realize this wasn't going to be a simple conversation between neighbors. The county records office turned out to be one of those government buildings where everything smells like old paper and the fluorescent lights make everyone look slightly dead. But Harold was already there waiting for me, grinning like he'd just solved a murder case. The map he'd found was dated 1973, and it was beautiful in its simplicity. Clear black lines, official county stamps, and right there in the middle of it all was my walking path, labeled in faded typewriter text as public right-of-way, established access. Harold spread it out on the research table like he was revealing buried treasure. The yellowed edge of the paper felt like a receipt from time itself. "This path has been legally protected for over 50 years, he explained, pointing to the relevant section. "Your HOA can't just decide to close it because they don't like how it looks." Looking at that map, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Relief. Actual physical relief, like someone had just told me I didn't have cancer. But then Harold hit me with the reality check. Having the legal right is one thing, making them respect that right is something else entirely. We made copies of everything, and Harold walked me through the legal language until I understood exactly what we were dealing with. Apparently, when the neighborhood was originally developed, the county had required several public access points to the lake as a condition of the building permits. My little walking path was one of those access points, which meant it wasn't just protected, it was specifically required to remain open. "Your HOA either doesn't know this," Harold said, "or they're hoping you don't know this." I wasn't sure which possibility made me angrier. My grandfather would have spit on this kind of nonsense. Did they really not do their research before shutting down my path? Or were they deliberately trying to intimidate me into backing down? Either way, I was starting to realize that Lorraine Beaumont might have picked the wrong fight. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in my life. I ordered a custom sign from a professional printing shop. Nothing too crazy, just a simple white background with black lettering that said "Public Right-of-Way, Use Right Protected by Law," with an arrow pointing directly at the HOA's dirt pile and orange fencing. The sign shop guy asked if I wanted it laminated for weather protection, and I told him absolutely. If I was going to make a statement, I wanted it to last. When I picked it up 2 days later, it looked official enough to be a government marker, which was exactly the vibe I was going for. It wasn't just a sign, it was a flag. I installed that sign at exactly 6:30 in the morning, right at the edge of my property line where it would be impossible to miss. I wasn't sure if it would last 5 minutes or 5 days, but at least I'd spoken the truth out loud for anyone who cared to read it. My neighbor from across the street, a guy who I'd only talked to a few times, came walking over while I was hammering the signpost into the ground. "You actually dare put that sign right in front of the HOA?" he asked. And I could tell he wasn't sure if I was brave or just stupid. "I've got nothing left to lose except these muddy boots," I told him, which made him laugh but also made me realize how far this whole situation had pushed me. 3 weeks ago, I never would have imagined myself in a legal battle over a walking path. The reaction was faster than I expected. By 10 o'clock that morning, Lorraine Beaumont was standing in my driveway, staring at my sign with an expression that could have melted steel. She didn't knock on my door or introduce herself properly, just stood there like she was waiting for me to come outside and explain myself. When I finally did walk out to see what she wanted, she launched into this speech about unauthorized signage and violation of community standards. But here's the thing that made the whole conversation worth it. She couldn't actually demand that I remove the sign, because everything on it was legally accurate. She kept dancing around the edges, talking about proper procedures and community input, but never directly challenged the facts. Watching her struggle to find something wrong with my sign while knowing she couldn't touch it, for once, she blinked first. It tasted better than morning coffee. Harold had also mentioned something during our research session that I didn't think much about at the time, but which stuck in the back of my mind. "You know," he'd said while we were packing up the maps, "lakefront structures built before 1980 might be exempt from a lot of these new regulations the HOA is trying to enforce." I thought briefly about my dock, which my father and I had built together the summer after I graduated college, but I was so focused on the path dispute that I didn't really process what Harold was telling me. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to that comment, but sometimes the most important information comes at you when you're not ready to hear it. That evening, word started spreading around the neighborhood that the HOA might not know what they were doing. My neighbor stopped by again, this time with his wife, and they mentioned that several other residents had been talking about my sign. "People are starting to ask questions," his wife said, "questions about what other mistakes the board might be making." I wasn't sure if that was good news or bad news, but it definitely felt like something was shifting in the neighborhood dynamic. The orange fencing was still there, but now everyone who walked by could see my sign explaining why it shouldn't be. I noticed another neighbor had put up a small sign in their yard asking who voted for these new rules, and someone else had started an email chain asking for copies of the original HOA bylaws. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if putting up that sign was the smartest thing I'd ever done or the biggest mistake of my life. The legal facts were on my side, but Lorraine Beaumont didn't strike me as someone who gave up easily. Something told me this was far from over, and I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever came next. But for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like maybe I wasn't fighting this battle completely alone. I woke up at 5:45 in the morning to the sound of diesel engines warming up in my backyard. Not near my backyard, not in the general area, literally right outside my bedroom window, where no construction equipment had any business being at dawn. I stumbled to the window, still half asleep, and what I saw made my blood pressure spike instantly. 2 bright yellow bulldozers were parked about 30 feet from my back door, and a crew of workers was already setting up orange cones and surveying equipment. This wasn't the same half-hearted fencing operation from before. This was serious, industrial-grade earth-moving that meant business. I threw on some clothes and practically ran outside, my heart pounding because I knew exactly what was about to happen to my walking path. The earth groaned like it knew betrayal was coming. Lorraine Beaumont was already there, dressed like she was heading to a board meeting at 7 in the morning, clipboard in hand and that same expressionless face I was starting to hate. When she saw me approaching, she didn't even wait for me to ask what was happening. "We're renovating this pathway to create a more professional appearance that matches our community standards," she announced, like she was reading from a press release. "The new landscaping will include proper drainage, decorative stone borders, and native plant installations that will enhance property values for all residents through aesthetic, ecosystem optimization, and lifestyle cohesion improvement." I actually had to process that for a few seconds. They were tearing up my path to make it prettier? That can't be right, can it? But before I could ask any questions, she added the part that made my stomach drop. "Unfortunately, during the renovation period, this area will be completely inaccessible to pedestrian traffic." The renovation period. She said it like it was a temporary inconvenience. but something in her tone told me this renovation was going to take exactly as long as it took for me to give up and find somewhere else to live. I watched the bulldozer operators checking their equipment and measuring distances, and I realized this wasn't about making things prettier. This was about making sure I never used this path again. "How long is this renovation supposed to take?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Several months at minimum," Lorraine replied without looking at me. "Complex landscaping projects require adequate time to establish proper root systems and ensure long-term sustainability through integrated environmental harmonization processes." I swear she was making this stuff up as she went along, but the bulldozers were real enough. I was actually about to start removing my dock stairs and preparing for the worst, assuming this was the beginning of the end for my lake access entirely, but then something happened that changed everything. The morning light hit that old wooden sign on my dock just right, and I could clearly read the faded text I'd been walking past for 2 years without really noticing. Built 1979, M. Sterling and Son. My father and I had carved those letters into that weathered piece of cedar the day we finished construction, both of us sunburned and exhausted but proud of what we'd accomplished together. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in my muddy backyard anymore. "He passes me the hammer, I miss the nail, he smiles anyway." Harold's words suddenly echoed in my head like stadium floodlights switching on. Structures before 1980 might be exempt. A light bulb went off in my brain so bright it practically made me dizzy. My dock, my beautiful, legally grandfathered, completely untouchable dock that was built 2 full years before any of these new HOA regulations existed. I looked at Lorraine, who was still standing there with her clipboard, completely focused on the bulldozers and totally unaware that she'd just awakened something she never saw coming. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something that wasn't anger or frustration. I felt power. Real, legal, documentation-backed power that was sitting right there in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be used. I almost started laughing right there in my pajamas, but I managed to keep my expression neutral while my brain started working through all the implications. Instead of arguing or begging or making threats, I looked Lorraine straight in the eye and said, very calmly, "You're going to regret this decision, Lorraine." She gave me that same condescending look she'd perfected, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. "I understand you're upset, Mr. Sterling, but sometimes progress requires temporary sacrifice." I wish I could tell you I kept my cool at that point, but come on, who wouldn't snap at that kind of corporate doublespeak? But instead of losing my temper, I just smiled and walked back toward my house. "We'll see," I called over my shoulder, and I could tell from her expression that my tone had confused her. She thought I was defeated. That made us even. I went straight inside and called Harold, my hands actually shaking as I dialed his number. "Harold, I need you to research something for me immediately," I said when he picked up. "My dock was built in 1979. What does that mean legally in terms of HOA jurisdiction?" There was a pause, and then Harold started chuckling. "Oh my," he said. "Oh my, Marcus, that changes everything." He promised to confirm the details and get back to me within 2 hours, but from his reaction I could tell I was thinking along the right lines. While I waited for his call, I sat on my porch and watched those bulldozers tear up my walking path, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry about it. She was digging a hole. I just needed to hand her the shovel. The sound of earth being moved and trees being knocked down should have been devastating, but instead it felt like watching someone dig their own grave. Every scoop of dirt those machines moved was another step toward Lorraine discovering exactly how big a mistake she'd made. The other residents who walked by kept giving me sympathetic looks like they felt sorry for me losing my path access, but I just waved and smiled. They had absolutely no idea what they were witnessing. This wasn't the end of my lake access. This was the beginning of Lorraine Beaumont's education in property law and the consequences of not doing proper research before starting a war. As I watched those bulldozers tear up my path, I almost felt sorry for Lorraine. She had absolutely no idea what she'd just awakened, and something told me she was going to find out the hard way that some battles aren't worth picking. I wasn't sure exactly how this was going to play out, but for the first time since receiving that first HOA letter, I felt like maybe I was going to be okay after all. Harold's research confirmed what I had been hoping for, and his phone call that afternoon made my entire week. "Your dock is completely grandfathered under county regulations," he explained, barely containing his excitement. "Not only is it exempt from current HOA restrictions, but any structure that provides lake access and was built before 1980 actually has protected status under county waterfront preservation laws. protected status. I made him repeat that part twice because I wanted to make sure I understood correctly. My little wooden dock wasn't just legal, it was legally protected by the county government itself. I exhaled, like I'd been underwater for weeks. But Harold also gave me some strategic advice that made perfect sense. Don't play that card yet. Let them dig themselves deeper first. So instead of immediately confronting Lorraine with my dock revelation, I decided to try a different approach. I spent the next week creating simple flyers on my home computer. Having trouble with HOA rules that don't make sense? Share your story with a neighbor who's been there. I printed about 50 copies and spent 2 evenings walking around the neighborhood, leaving them in mailboxes and tucked under windshield wipers. 50 sheets of paper folded like weapons. I wasn't sure if anyone would actually call, but I figured it was worth finding out if I was the only one dealing with this kind of harassment. Maybe I should have just walked away and found a different place to live. I don't know. But something about the whole situation felt bigger than just my walking path. The response was faster and more overwhelming than I expected. My phone started ringing the next evening, and it didn't stop for 3 days. The first call was from an elderly couple who lived about 6 blocks away. "Wait, really?" the wife said when I explained my situation. "They fined us $200 for planting the wrong kind of bushes in our own front yard." Bushes! In our own yard! I thought we were the only ones getting the special treatment. Her husband got on the phone and told me about getting cited for having non-compliant outdoor furniture on his deck. Apparently, boxwood hedges are the downfall of civilization. Seriously? Did they really think they could fine people for having the wrong color patio chairs? A local business owner called the next evening, and her story made my blood boil. She runs a small home-based business doing bookkeeping for local shops, and the HOA had banned her from putting a tiny business sign in her own yard. Not a huge billboard or anything obnoxious, just a modest sign that said, "Accounting Services," with her phone number. "They told me it created commercial visual pollution in a residential area," she explained. "But half the board members have real estate signs in their yards year-round. How is that different?" I actually had to stop and stare at the phone after that one. The hypocrisy was so blatant, it was almost impressive. As I listened to more stories, a darker pattern emerged. They seemed to target isolated residents, older folks who wouldn't fight back, anyone who looked compliant or afraid. But the call that really got to me came from a retired librarian who'd been living in the neighborhood for almost 20 years. She had this calm, thoughtful way of speaking that reminded me of my grandmother. And when she started telling me about her experience with Lorraine's board, I could hear the hurt in her voice. "Are you fighting for that path?" she asked me, "or for the self-respect they took away from you?" That question stayed with me longer than the mud on my boots. That question hit me harder than I expected, because she was absolutely right. This wasn't really about convenient lake access anymore. It was about refusing to let someone else control my life just because they had a little bit of bureaucratic power. Have you ever dealt with someone who thought they owned your entire neighborhood? You'd probably just want to pack up and move away, right? The retired librarian also filled me in on some neighborhood history that I hadn't known. Apparently, Lorraine had moved here only 8 months ago, immediately run for HOA president, and won by promising to elevate community standards and protect property values. But what she'd actually done was triple the number of violation notices, increase HOA fees by 40%, and start enforcing rules that had never been enforced before. "She's turned our neighborhood into a police state," the librarian said. "People are afraid to plant flowers or paint their mailboxes without checking with the board first." I wish I could tell you I was surprised, but honestly, it sounded exactly like something Lorraine would do. The most shocking revelation came from 2 current HOA board members who called me secretly, asking me not to use their names. Apparently, Lorraine had been making decisions without proper board votes and claiming authority she didn't actually have. "She told us the path closure was a county requirement," one of them whispered over the phone. "But when we asked to see the documentation, she said it was too complicated for us to understand." Too complicated? That can't be right. Can it? These weren't stupid people. They were elected board members who deserved to see the legal justification for major decisions. Power crumbles from the inside first. This was the sound of cracking. The more I learned about Lorraine's management style, the more I realized this wasn't just about power. It was about someone who genuinely believed other people were too dumb to question her authority. I've shared enough stories on QA Stories to know that every neighborhood has its power-hungry wannabe dictator, but Lorraine was taking it to a whole new level of crazy. The pattern was becoming clear. She'd identify someone who might question her decisions, then find technical violations to keep them busy defending themselves, instead of organizing opposition. It was actually pretty clever in a completely evil way, but it also meant she'd probably made more enemies than she realized, which gave me an idea for how to handle the final confrontation. 3 days later, I ran into Lorraine at the grocery store, and the encounter was almost surreal. She was standing in the produce section, examining apples with the same intense focus she brought to everything else, and when she noticed me, she just stared. Not a friendly neighborhood wave or even a cold nod, just a long, evaluating stare like she was trying to figure out what I was planning. I gave her my biggest, most mysterious smile and said, "Beautiful day, isn't it, Lorraine?" She didn't respond, just kept staring while I picked out some bananas and walked away. She gripped the apple too tightly. It split. Let her think she's still winning, I thought. Let her think I've given up and accepted defeat. That night, I sat on my dock watching the sunset and thinking about everything I'd learned from my neighbors. I had enough ammunition to completely destroy Lorraine's little power empire. The question was, did I have the guts to actually pull the trigger? Looking back, I still can't believe how much my life had changed in just a few weeks. A month ago, my biggest concern was whether to buy a new fishing rod. Now I was planning what felt like a neighborhood revolution, and I wasn't sure if that made me a hero or just another person who'd let a property dispute take over their life. But something had shifted in the neighborhood's mood. They weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and even though I was expecting something like this, seeing it in official legal language still made my stomach tighten. Mandatory Mediation Conference, Sterling versus Pine Lake Community HOA, was printed across the top in bold letters with a date and time that was exactly 2 weeks away. Apparently, rather than going straight to court, both sides were required to attempt resolution through a county preservation mediation program first. I'd never been to anything like this before, and I wasn't sure if that was good news or bad news for my case. Harold assured me it was actually perfect because mediators tend to focus on facts rather than emotions, and we definitely had the facts on our side. He looked like he was going to a garden party. I felt like I was going to war. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room at the county courthouse. Harold and I arrived 15 minutes early, partly because we wanted to get settled, and partly because I was too nervous to sit around waiting any longer. The mediator turned out to be a middle-aged woman who explained that her job was to help both sides find a solution without going to court. "I'm not here to decide who's right or wrong," she said. "I'm here to facilitate communication and hopefully reach an agreement that works for everyone." That sounded reasonable enough, but then Lorraine walked in with her legal representation, and I realized this wasn't going to be the friendly conversation I'd been hoping for. The HOA had hired a young, aggressive lawyer named Patrick O'Connell, who looked like he'd graduated law school about 6 months ago and was determined to prove himself with complex legal language and intimidation tactics. He opened with a 20-minute presentation about community standards enforcement and property value protection strategies that was clearly designed to make me feel stupid and out of my depth. He kept using phrases like precedential establishment and regulatory compliance frameworks that probably sounded impressive to someone who didn't know any better. It sounded like a TED Talk delivered by a blender. I actually had to stop myself from laughing when he started talking about aesthetic impact assessments for a dirt walking path through some trees. But then Harold stood up and the entire energy in the room shifted. He didn't need to raise his voice or use fancy words or wave around thick folders full of documentation. He just calmly laid down one piece of paper on the table, the 1973 county survey map, and the entire room went dead silent. "This is the original county plat map showing public right-of-ways designations for the Pine Lake Community Development," Harold said in his professor voice. "You'll notice that the pathway in question is clearly marked as required public access, established as a condition of the original building permits." The mediator leaned forward to examine the map, and I watched Patrick O'Connell's confident expression slowly dissolve into confusion. Lorraine's face went completely white when she saw the map, and for the first time since I'd met her, she actually looked uncertain. Her smile froze halfway through a breath, like someone had pulled the power cord on her face. We weren't aware of any historical right-of-ways designations," she said, glancing at Patrick like she was expecting him to make this problem disappear. But Patrick was busy staring at the map, and probably realizing that his client had hired him to fight a battle they'd already lost. "This appears to be authentic county documentation," the mediator said after examining Harold's paperwork. "Do you have any documentation that supersedes or modifies these original access requirements?" The silence that followed that question was beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Patrick tried to recover by arguing that current HOA authority supersedes historical county designations and community standards take precedence over outdated access provisions, but even I could tell he was making stuff up as he went along. Harold just sat there with this calm smile while Patrick dug himself deeper with every sentence. It was like watching a magician get caught palming cards. Finally, the mediator asked the question that ended the entire mediation. Mr. O'Connell, can you provide any legal precedent for HOA authority to override county-established public right-of-ways designations? Patrick shuffled through his papers for what felt like 5 minutes before admitting that he would need to research that specific legal question and get back to her. If you were in my shoes, would you have stopped there and called it a win or kept pushing for total victory? I thought I'd jump up and celebrate when it became obvious we'd won, but instead I just felt completely exhausted. This was only one battle in what felt like a war, and something told me Lorraine wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. I want to be very clear about something, she said during the final discussion. This mediation result doesn't change the overall direction of community development in Pine Lake. The board will continue to pursue improvements that benefit all residents. The way she said it, like this, was just a temporary setback in her larger plan to control everything. I actually had to stop and stare at her after that one. The final agreement was everything I could have hoped for. The HOA would remove all barriers from the walking path within 7 days, restore the area to its original condition within 30 days, and pay my legal expenses plus a $500 inconvenience fee. The mediator made it very clear that failure to comply would result in immediate county intervention and potential legal action against the board. Watching Lorraine sign that agreement, her hand shaking slightly with what I assumed was suppressed rage, felt like the most satisfying moment of my adult life. 2 years ago, I thought this dock was for fishing. Today, it was justice on paper. But then I caught the look in her eyes and I realized something important. Instead of her usual corporate doublespeak about community improvements, Lorraine's parting words were different this time. Cold, personal. You won the path, she said quietly, looking directly at me as she gathered her papers. Don't expect to keep the peace. The way she said it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the courthouse air conditioning. This wasn't about HOA regulations anymore. This was about someone who just made my conflict with her very, very personal. Victory felt amazing for about 10 minutes. Then I realized that someone like Lorraine doesn't just give up and walk away after losing a public legal battle. She reloads and comes back harder, looking for a different angle of attack. As we walked out of the courthouse, Harold patted me on the shoulder and said, "Well done, but don't get too comfortable. People like that don't learn from losing. They just get more creative about winning." I wasn't sure if he was trying to warn me or prepare me, but something in his tone told me this whole mess was far from over. Victory has a shadow, and hers had just started moving. I should have known that winning the mediation was just the beginning, not the end. Lorraine Beaumont struck me as someone who viewed legal defeats as temporary inconveniences rather than permanent setbacks, and I was right. The orange fencing disappeared, and my walking path was restored exactly as the agreement required. But I could feel something brewing in the neighborhood atmosphere that told me she was planning her next move. I just didn't expect it to come in the form of a comprehensive safety inspection of all lakefront structures announced in an official HOA newsletter that arrived in everyone's mailbox on a Wednesday morning. The timing wasn't a coincidence. The newsletter explained that the board had hired a licensed professional engineer to conduct urgent safety evaluations of all docks, boathouses, and waterfront construction throughout the community. Recent concerns about structural integrity and liability issues require immediate professional assessment, the announcement read, and I knew without any doubt that those recent concerns were specifically about my dock. Dylan Price, the engineer they'd hired, was scheduled to inspect my property the following Monday at 9 in the morning. I wasn't sure if I should be worried or amused, but I definitely wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of creative problem solving I'd expected from someone who'd already proven she doesn't give up easily. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and the kind of humidity that made everything feel sticky and uncomfortable. Dylan Price turned out to be a soft-spoken guy in his 50s who seemed genuinely professional and not particularly interested in HOA politics. He explained that he'd been asked to evaluate all lakefront structures for compliance with current safety standards and building code requirements, and he assured me that his assessment would be completely objective and based solely on engineering principles. I appreciated his professional attitude, but watching him examine my dock still felt like watching a doctor examine a dying family member. Dylan's every movement felt like a judgment, and every note he wrote on his clipboard made my stomach tighten a little more. The inspection took almost 2 hours, during which Dylan methodically tested every board, examined every joint, and documented every aspect of my dock's construction with scientific precision. I followed him around like an anxious parent, trying not to ask too many questions but desperate to know what he was finding. "This is actually very solid construction," he said at one point, running his hands along the main support beams. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." I told him it was my father and me, the summer after I graduated college, and Dylan smiled. "That explains it. Father-son construction projects usually get extra attention to detail." While he tested beams, I remembered sanding those edges with Dad's old rasp. It was nice to hear, but I was still worried about what his final report might say. While Dylan was finishing his measurements, I had a sudden inspiration and went inside to search through some storage boxes in my basement. I knew my father had kept detailed records of everything we'd built together, and somewhere in those boxes was his old construction notebook with the original dock plans. It took me almost 45 minutes of digging through dusty cardboard boxes, but I finally unearthed it. My father's leather-bound notebook, filled with careful handwriting, complete with sketches, material lists, and construction notes. The page I was looking for had a handwritten note at the top that made my heart race. "Started building dock, spring 1979. When I brought the notebook outside, Dylan's reaction was exactly what I'd been hoping for. "This is incredible documentation," he said, carefully examining my father's sketches and notes. "Original construction records from 1979 would make this structure grandfathered and legally untouchable. Anything built before 1980 is exempt from current building code requirements." Grandfathered. Protected. Completely exempt. Those words felt like music after weeks of stress and uncertainty. Dylan spent another 30 minutes reviewing the notebook and cross-referencing it with his measurements, and when he finished, he looked up at me with a slightly amazed expression. "Mr. Sterling, this dock isn't just safe and structurally sound," Dylan said, packing up his equipment. "It's also completely exempt from all current HOA regulations regarding lakefront structures. The combination of its pre-1980 construction date and the quality of the original building documentation means that no current authority can require modifications or improvements." He handed me a business card and promised to have his written report completed within 3 days. "I'll be sending copies to you, the HOA board, and the county building department," he added. "This should resolve any questions about your dock's legal status once and for all." I walked Dylan drive away, then walked back to my dock and sat down on the same bench where my father and I used to fish together on summer evenings. The irony of the whole situation wasn't lost on me. Lorraine had hired an engineer to find problems with my dock, and instead he'd provided professional documentation that made it legally untouchable. I couldn't help wondering if she realized yet that her safety inspection had just backfired spectacularly, or if she was still expecting Dylan's report to give her the ammunition she needed to shut down my lake access permanently. The answer came that Thursday afternoon when I saw Lorraine's car parked in my driveway. She was standing next to her vehicle with a folder in her hands, staring at my dock with an expression that was hard to read. When she noticed me approaching, she didn't launch into her usual speech about community standards or property values. Instead, she went completely quiet, then forced this weird smile, then actually stepped backward like she was afraid I might attack her or something. "I received a copy of the engineering report," she said, her voice had shrunk. "It appears your dock meets all applicable safety requirements." The dock outlived her argument, and I'd just watched her realize it. Watching Lorraine walk away that afternoon, her perfect posture finally showing signs of defeat, I couldn't help wondering if completely crushing someone's dreams of control made me the hero of this story, or just another villain with better lawyers. I'd won every battle so far, but something told me the war wasn't over yet. And maybe, just maybe, winning wasn't going to feel as satisfying as I'd been expecting. I'd been thinking about the retired librarian's question for weeks. Was I fighting for the path or for the self-respect they took away from me? The answer became clear when I decided to organize a community meeting at the local community center. not just to resolve my own situation, but to address what had become a neighborhood-wide problem with HOA overreach. I called everyone who'd ever complained. Most showed up. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening, and I secretly invited a reporter from the county newspaper who'd been covering local government issues. 38 people showed up that evening, which was far more than I'd expected, and apparently far more than Lorraine had expected either. She arrived exactly at 7 with 2 other board members, looking confident and prepared for what she probably assumed would be a small group of complainers she could easily dismiss. But when she walked into that room and saw how many neighbors were there, along with a reporter taking notes in the back corner, her expression shifted from confidence to concern pretty quickly. "I wasn't aware this was going to be a media event," she said to me quietly, and I could tell she was already calculating damage control strategies. The meeting format was simple. Anyone who wanted to share their experience with the current HOA board could speak for up to 5 minutes, and then we'd discuss potential solutions as a community. I went first, summarizing my path dispute and dock inspection saga, but keeping my tone factual rather than angry. I wanted people to focus on the pattern of behavior rather than just my personal grievances. The response from other residents was more powerful than I'd expected and definitely more emotional than I was prepared for. The elderly husband spoke second, and his voice actually shook when he described getting fined for non-compliant bushes that had been growing in his front yard for 15 years. "I'm not afraid of the HOA, he said, looking directly at Lorraine. His wife added that they'd been considering moving after living in the neighborhood for 23 years, just to escape the constant fear of violation notices. The business owner spoke next about her sign ban, and her frustration was obvious. "We moved here for peace and quiet," she said, "not to live like there are security cameras watching our every move." But the retired librarian's testimony was what really changed the energy in the room. She'd been quiet and thoughtful throughout the other presentations, and when she stood up to speak, everyone leaned forward to listen. When you make people afraid to plant flowers or hang decorations without permission, you're not protecting anything. You're destroying the sense of community that makes a neighborhood worth living in. She looked directly at Lorraine during her entire speech, and I watched Lorraine's face go through several different shades of pale. When it was time for Lorraine to respond, she launched into a prepared speech about property values and community standards that sounded like corporate marketing copy. She spoke corporate, not human. She talked about long-term neighborhood investment strategies and aesthetic consistency frameworks while completely ignoring the specific complaints people had raised. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that had been driving everyone crazy for months, and watching her deliver it to a room full of angry neighbors was almost surreal. Did she really think people would be impressed by fancy language when they were describing real problems affecting their daily lives? The turning point came when someone from the back of the room called for a vote of no confidence in the current board leadership. No one had planned this, but it happened fast. Once the idea was proposed, it gained momentum quickly. The mediator from my previous case happened to be in attendance as a neighborhood resident, and she confirmed that community meetings could indeed vote on HOA board performance as long as proper procedures were followed. The vote of no confidence was unanimous. 38 hands shot up in the air, including 2 from current board members, who apparently felt comfortable expressing their real opinions in a public setting. Lorraine's face went through every shade of pale I didn't know existed during that vote. She stood there for a long moment, looking around the room like she was seeing all these people for the very first time. Then she just walked out, folder clenched, eyes vacant. No dramatic speech, no threats, no final insults. Just pure, complete defeat. Everyone else stayed to discuss next steps for neighborhood governance. I actually felt sorry for her in that moment, which surprised me because I'd been angry at her for so long. The new HOA board that was elected that evening approached me afterward with genuine apologies and a proposal that caught me completely off guard. They wanted to make things right, they said, and they offered to pay me a monthly rental fee to use my dock as the community's main lake access point. I almost started laughing at the irony. After all these weeks of fighting to protect my dock from HOA interference, they now wanted to pay me to share it with everyone. "No," I told the new chairman. "You can use it whenever you want, as much as you want, but it stays mine forever, and we're putting that in writing." 3 months later, I'm sitting on that same dock, watching the sunset turn the lake into liquid gold, and everything feels different in the best possible way. Kids are jumping off the far end while their parents chat and laugh on the shore. Families have picnics on the weathered planks during weekends, and teenagers use it as a diving platform on hot summer days. The whole community uses the dock now, and nobody asks permission or pays fees or fills out forms. It's exactly what my dad and I dreamed about when we built it together all those years ago. Where her signs once hung, kids now tied towels and picnic blankets. Lorraine moved away 6 weeks after the community meeting. I heard through the grapevine that she bought a condo in some gated community with even stricter rules than she tried to create here. I guess some people really never learn what makes a neighborhood worth living in. The funny thing is, I get Christmas cards now from neighbors I'd never even talked to before. The elderly couple invited me to their anniversary party. The business owner's company is thriving now that she can actually advertise from her own property. And the retired librarian, well, she just smiles and waves every morning when I walk down to my dock. I'm honestly not someone who enjoys winning fights or crushing other people's dreams of control, but this time, I had to see it through, because if I had let them take my lake access, who knows what they would have tried to control next? My house color, my car, my friends. Sometimes you don't fight for what you want, you fight for what you refuse to lose. The moment you try to control everything, you end up with nothing. But when you're willing to share what you have, that's when you actually win. The dock stayed mine. But now it belonged to all of us. If this story hit home, hit like, subscribe to QA Stories and drop a comment. And if you'd like to support more stories like this, that little thanks button down there really helps. See y'all next time.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.